Saturday, long weekend, and that so many people have come to listen to something which is not normally a very popular subject. It gratifies me that you have actually interested in this subject. So therefore, what we will do is let me speak for about half an hour or 40 minutes or so. My views on national security. You may not agree. All of you are law students, so I'll urge you to critically examine what I say. If you have a difference of opinion, please feel free to contradict me, refute, or comment or suggest, and debate a point if you have one. And you can ask questions, of course we'll do. So we'll keep about half an hour for questions and about 40 minutes that I'll speak, so that we can have a longer, maybe half an hour, or maybe 40 minutes for question answers, whatever way we go. But before I sort of come to this book is incidental. I think Ganesh insisted, that's why I brought these copies. I'm not here to sell the book; it can sell itself because it is already. I must say that just 2 days ago we've signed a contract. Somebody has bought the rights for the book. It is going to be a feature film in the next 1 year, Hindi feature film. Based on this book, so that and then there is a series of documentaries that are airing on History Channel. One of them got aired yesterday. The premiere was on 22nd on the surgical strikes and the Pathankot operations that have happened under this government. So I'm a major initiator of that project with History Channel, and I'm also part of the people who have commented on in that documentary. It may not be available on YouTube at the moment, but it is there. It might be repeated, and then next month you will see something on surgical strikes in Myanmar, and then Pathankot operations in March. So that is the background that I come from. He's already introduced me at length, so I am not going to bore you with my details. But I've been a journalist all my life, and I now run a website called bharatshakti.in for the last 2 years. It is mainly about defense, and our tagline is self-reliance in defense. So we are trying to encourage Indian companies, Indian products in the defense sector, and especially for the Indian Armed Forces. So basically, Indian solutions for Indian problems in the Armed Forces is what we are trying to do or support. But let me come to the topic that Ganesh has given me, that is national security. Now, it's very difficult to, I would say, define or capture the entire gamut of national security in one talk like this. But I'll attempt to do that. And the issue is that what is national security? Is it about sheer numbers? Is it about Indian Armed Forces, which number about 1.5 million? Or if you take the Central Armed Police Forces like the CRPF, the BSF, the CISF, the SSB, the Intelligence Corps, and everyone, if you take, they might go up to about 30 lakh people. So Army, Navy, Air Force is about 1.5 million or 15 lakh, and then another nearly 1.2 million, or a little more than that, the Central Armed Police Forces, besides the police forces in the states. Every state has a police force. Is that national security? Is it about defending your land borders and sea borders or maritime borders and your airspace? Well, yes, in a way that is the fundamental of national security. Because sovereignty is, as we know, under the Westphalian system that has evolved over the past 2 or 3 centuries, where a nation state is defined as what it is, with territorial boundaries which are sacrosanct. Wars have happened because territorial boundaries have been violated. People have tried to grab land and have tried to intrude into Indian or any other country's sovereign territory, which is defined, well defined. Maps are very sacrosanct. We also in India, if somebody shows Pakistan occupied Kashmir as part of say Pakistan, or Aksai Chin as part of China, Indian government immediately protests. So sovereignty is sacrosanct. But defending borders physically, um, is that national security? And whose responsibility is national security? Is it only the armed forces, the military, the police, the people who are at the helm of national security? Well, I think the notions and definition of national security is changing every decade. Initially, when the nation states were formed, it was the duty of the ruler, duty of the government, later democratic governments or otherwise, to defend the territorial integrity and territorial space that every nation had. But over the years, national security definition has expanded. I won't say changed, but expanded. Military remains at the center of it, but the national security apparatus and national security thinking has also undergone a tremendous change over the past, say, 17, 18 years since, say, I would say 2001. Why do I say 2001? Is the turning point in terrorism or the journey of terrorism in this century was the defining moment of the attack on World Trade Center by the Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden's followers. All of us remember or if you've seen on television or YouTube, the image of the aeroplanes going and dashing themselves or crashing into the World Trade Center, and they're coming down, and followed by a huge war in Afghanistan and followed by war in Iraq. All kinds of things have happened. So terrorism is now the bigger challenge. As you look around the world, as we speak just now, there has been multiple attacks in Kabul, Afghanistan's capital. Some 40 odd people have been killed already. As I came in here, I was reading, and it's continuing. If you look at Baghdad, if you look at Syria, if you look at Iraq, the constant terrorist attacks and bomb blasts and killings that happen. So national security definition has expanded in many senses, that earlier only standing armies and standing air force would defend any attack on a nation or any nation state. But today it might seem completely irrelevant to have the armies. They have not been able to prevent attack on, let's say, in Kabul or in Iraq, or attack in Bali, which is in Indonesia, which is a tourist spot, or something that happens in Paris, which happened 2 years ago, or in London, constant bus attacks. So from the earlier terrorist attacks of killing people on the buses or attacking a community, we've seen suicide bombers perfected by the LTTE in Tamil Nadu or in Sri Lanka. Then we have now come to a phase where buses or vehicles are being used as weapons of destruction. You go into big crowded markets and run a vehicle over people, hundreds of people, and maybe kill 70, 80 people like that. So the terrorists seem to be always a step ahead or 2 steps ahead of the law enforcement agencies. So the challenges continue to multiply, and the challenges continue to emanate, new challenges continue to emanate. So what is national security? Again, I come back to that same question. So therefore, centuries ago, all of you are aware of the name Chanakya, right? Kautilya, who had defined a nation state, that time the kingdom, being under threat of 4 kinds of threats, 4 kinds of challenges that might come. One would be an internally initiated and internally sponsored, let's say, I won't say agitation, but or disturbance, right? So it's something that would be done by disgruntled elements within a nation state, and also sponsored by disgruntled leaders. So that was one. So enemies, he defined enemy or threats to a nation state in 4 definitions or 4 statements. One is internally initiated, internally sponsored. The other is internally initiated but externally sponsored. And where would that be in India? In Kashmir. Very evident, very glaring example of proxy war that Pakistan has been fighting against India since 1948. that there is some disgruntlement in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Some people think that they should have a separate state or a separate autonomous kind of an arrangement. That is fueled by Pakistan by sending their own people, either terrorist or otherwise. And so therefore it is internally initiated, externally sponsored. That is the second part. There are also externally abated, externally sponsored. Externally initiated, externally sponsored. So that would sort of not apply to India so far, because we don't have, although people keep trying, there are enough inimical elements that India has against itself, where there are people who want to weaken India, threaten India, weaken India from within and outside both. So that is the other one. And the fourth one is externally initiated and internally sponsored. So somebody initiates a disturbance or a plan to disturb peace in India, and which is supported by people who are within, who are called the proxy agents. So Jammu Kashmir can be both. Internally initiated, externally sponsored, externally initiated, internally sponsored. Right? So centuries ago Chanakya had said this, and it is a continuum that the national security is threatened by these kind of threats across the board. And as I said, the scope of threats, I am coming to national security or how to defend national security, how to define national security a little later. I am outlining for you the threat scenario, mainly to understand so that what needs to be done to counter all that, or what the governments do, or what the government is doing, is something that we'll talk about. Having given you this definition, a theoretical definition, now look at the map of this country. Start from the north. All of you are aware of what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir. There are disgruntled elements, there are people who benefit from fanning the discontentment and constantly saying that we have been discriminated against and we need a separate identity, more autonomy, more money, all kinds of things. And then Pakistan fueling that, because Pakistan sees this as a minimum effort, maximum impact kind of a war. It does not have to spend money, it knows it cannot match India's army or India's air force, given the size differential that is there. So they have chosen this path since 1990, because they got defeated in 3 wars, 1948, 1965, 1971. Then they decided that this is the best option, low cost option in Kashmir. So that is north. You come, they tried the same thing in Punjab. For a while they succeeded, for about 5-6 years. Khalistani movement was there, for a separate secessionist movement was there in Punjab. Then you go down, you had the LTTE in Tamil Nadu. Today, there may not be very evident threat in any of these parts except Jammu Kashmir and parts of Punjab, which is bordering Pakistan. But there is the Maoist, I won't say agitation, because it's an armed movement, Maoist armed movement in the central part of India, or heart of India, you can say. There used to be a definition of Maoism spreading its tentacles. They used to say it is going to now take over the area between Pashupati to Tirupati. Pashupati is in Nepal, the Pashupatinath temple, to Tirupati, which is in Andhra Pradesh. Somebody is here from Andhra Pradesh, I was told just you were there. So that was the idea that was being propagated by the Maoists themselves, who are not new enemies of the state in that sense. They have been at it since 1967, when Naxalbari village, people from Naxalbari village, Charu Mazumdar and Kanu Sanyal, actually rose in revolt in 1967, and 69 they launched this insurrection in Bengal first, and then it spread to, of course you can go back to Telangana in the peasants movement in 1949-50. The Kerala had some elements of extreme left-wing extremism. So all that was one phase. We are right now in that phase as far as left-wing extremism is concerned. In official parlance, it is defined as LWE, left-wing extremism. So now you must have read in the papers just about 2-3 days ago that the area that is under the control or influence of the left-wing extremists, that is the Maoists, has come down from say 220 districts in the country to about 58 districts. So it has shrunk. But it's a battle that goes on. Sometimes they have the upper hand, sometimes the government has the upper hand. The trick is to sustain the upper hand that the government has got. So it's not something that has ended. It is just, as I keep saying, they are down but they are not out. So that's the Naxal movement or the Maoist movement. You look at the northeast, again violence levels have come down, but you still have secessionist groups, separatist groups operating in the northeast. It used to have something like more than about 30 odd band groups, insurgent groups, some of them as old as 1956, the Naga groups, which have over the years splintered into different names. You had the United Liberation Front of Assam in Assam, you have the Bodo groups which are NDFB and BLT, again they have mutated, they have sort of split into different groups. And then of course you had the Meitei insurgency, you had insurgency in Tripura, all that. But even there, the violence levels have come down, the insurgency is waned. It is not completely died down, it will be a folly to say, but it is waned, it is under control of the government. So that is the threat scenario as far as old style insurgencies, violence, everything is concerned. But is that the only danger India faces? No, because there are other dangers. There are dangers of rising inequality, rising aspirations versus lack of adequate education. And this is where all of you as young people who are going to be leaders of tomorrow have to look at. That is our education spread evenly, one. And are we doing the right kind, are we imparting the right kind of education to make people employable? Today, many people are literate, but in my view, they are not educated. They are getting their degrees, but I would say 70 to 80% of them are not employable. They do not have the requisite skills to start a job or start a business because our education system has been flawed over the years. We have just encouraged people to look at only the marks rather than gaining knowledge. We are gaining only information or information required to write a newspaper and get the number of marks that you require to get admission into colleges and then pass out from there. So that is one of the major challenges. I will not call it a threat, but it's a challenge. Very often we speak about what we call a great demographic dividend that India has. That 65% of India's population is below 35 years. And therefore we are a young nation. We are going to be ruling the world. Rightfully so, that's a great expectation and I think we are on the right track. But if we don't watch our steps, if we don't take corrective measures to impart skills to our people, the right skills for employment, right skills for jobs, right skills for sustaining an economy, a diverse economy like we have, then we have problems there. Because when there is a mismatch between aspirations and ability, then there is disgruntlement. And that you might see around you, you are young people, all of you are young people. You might see a lot of people very unhappy with the state they are in. They might have an aspiration to get a job which starts off at 50, 60, 70, 80,000 rupees a month, but their ability may not be matching. And therefore, their can I have a glass of water? And therefore, the mismatch creates resentment. That resentment, if it is not limited to number of people, and if it explodes to too many youngsters, then we have a problem on hand. So that I think the government is aware of, and therefore the Skill India program. That not everybody can become a doctor or an engineer, but many of those people can become a technician, or can become a nursing assistant, or can become a pharmacist, something of that kind. Not everybody can go onto the top layer of employment, but there is a tier 2 and tier 3 that can go in. So that is another challenge that is there. Why am I telling you all this when, when I am talking about national security? Because national security, now I am coming to the view that I have about national security, is all about comprehensive national power. It's not about just hardware, it's not about how many tanks we have, how many airplanes we have, combat airplanes we have, how many submarines we have. No, that is one part, very small, tiny part of it. But national security or comprehensive national power comes from all these things that I mentioned. A very skillful population, a contented population, equal distribution of wealth, which is a dream, but still at least we should try to have equal distribution so that there is no resentment. We have caste problems in India, which we need to overcome. We of course have communal issues, but thankfully over the last 4 or 5 years the number of communal incidents or communal riots have been controlled. But caste has suddenly become a battleground. So if we don't keep our internal, like what Chanakya said centuries ago, if internally a nation state is disturbed, it is easy for an external power or an external aggressor to fan that internal disturbance. Very easy to light the passions or ignite something that is happening there. So therefore, what is the solution in this? The solution is that we as a country, and we as, thank you, not just the government, but we as a society should look at a comprehensive plan to develop this country in various sectors, technological, scientific, arts, business, economy. Everything should be simultaneously attempted to be developed. It's not that only we have military power, but we are socially we are divided, or socially there is disturbance between different communities. It doesn't give you any kind of strength that you require. You may have a strong army, but that army does not have the support in the society. If the army does not have enough people coming into its ranks as it grows older, then you have a problem. So therefore, the first requirement of any strong nation or a strong power is to have a strong economy. An economy that grows at a pace of say about 8.5 to 9% at least for the next 10 years, where you create wealth, you create enough jobs. Once wealth is created, job is created. When jobs are created, more wealth is created. So it's a vicious. It's not vicious, but it's a circle. And therefore, strong economy is extremely important as far as national security is concerned. Your military hardware cannot be bought. You cannot have enough money to buy the latest equipment for your armed forces if you don't have enough money. If you don't have enough money, your armed forces become weak. If your armed forces become weak, then you are not counted as a major power. So it's all interconnected. But the basic requirement in any country today, or in any nation state today, is to have a strong economy. A strong, stable economy, a strong, stable government, and a undisturbed or a peaceful environment internally. That's the first requirement, all these three factors. The fourth is to have a peaceful neighborhood. Now that is where India's problem begins, which is unique to India. Nobody else has this problem. That we have a neighbor on our west, Pakistan, which will not allow India to settle down, because they know that in the next 4 or 5 years or 10 years, India becomes economically and politically and diplomatically so strong that it will just get left behind. And therefore, it is trying its best to create disturbances, it's trying its best to pull India down or keep India down. And helping Pakistan in that is our northern neighbor, and that is China. The nexus between China and Pakistan has been there for more than 50 years now, but it has only grown stronger. Pakistan has become totally dependent on China for its survival, for its stability, and for its economy. So I in fact call Pakistan the 38th state of 38th province of China. It is like that because today China is giving them or has promised to give them $64 billion under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. US has threatened to withdraw the kind of money that they've been giving them for years together. You heard President Trump saying we gave them 32 or 35 billion dollars since 2001 and we haven't got anything in return. So that is in a churn. And yet both the China-Pakistan nexus as well as their attempt to keep India limited to South Asia is going to be a major national security challenge. So how do you deal with that is the question that the government will have to answer. The answer for us citizens is how do we make the government strong or the nation state strong? We do it by not indulging in bickering, not indulging in riots, skilling ourselves, creating wealth, making the economy stronger, making our technological base and scientific base stronger. That is something that we need to do. Look at, in a way, one must admire China for what they've done over the past 30 years, or a little more than 30 or 40 years now in fact. In 1978 they started opening up their economy and it's going to be, this year is the 40th anniversary of their liberalization, if I can say that. And in those 40 years they have transformed the country completely. Because they are single-minded, they are focused, they do not have, of course they do not have democracy, so there is no there is no diversity of opinion which will pull the government or the nation down. They will decide we want to demolish this slum to show Beijing to be beautiful. They will demolish it. There is going to be no NGO, there is going to be no lawyer, there is going to be no court to oppose that. In India, we will have at least 15 different entities and people to oppose. I'm just giving an example. It's not necessarily a bad thing that what happens in India. We are a democracy and we are proud of it. We should be proud of it. But sometimes it becomes difficult for governments to implement their program because we have too many forces pulling in different directions. So you have NGOs, you have lawyers, all of you are going to become lawyers. So there are lawyers, there is courts, there's the opposition party which will always try to sort of show the government in poor light. It's part of democracy. No point complaining about it. We have chosen to be a democratic country and we should be proud about it. All that I'm saying is that in some cases there has to be, national interest has to be above certain principles and national interest has to be above many of these differences. So to me, nation comes first. My own interest should come second. If you have that kind of attitude, individually, all of us, if they have the attitude, the nation or the country will progress. We have forgotten, and it is sometimes seen as something which is unfashionable, to say that I love the nation or I love my country more than I do myself, which I think needs to be revived. That if you want to progress as a people, as a country, we have to put nation first in certain cases. It cannot be an individual interest or group's interest that should override nation's interest. That is where the change needs to come. It should come from all of you as youngsters. All of you are going to be leaders in different fields. Some of you may go into politics, some may start firms, some may start businesses, some may fight very important cases as you go along. But my submission here is that, or some of you might become good writers or opinion makers. Some of you, I don't know whether you will go now into media, but some of you may have had dreams to become media people like us. But in that, my submission is that there will come a time when you will have to choose between your self-interest and nation's interest. And that is where the biggest challenge to your own personality will come. Do you want to put the nation's interest first? And that is where the soldiers differ from all of us. the people who are fighting for us, who are protecting us, they have this